Welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you have been following this channel for a while, you already know we focus on real human experiences that do not always have clear explanations, and we try to understand them in a simple and grounded way without forcing any belief. Today's story is about something many people live with every day, but often feel alone in facing, because even when it has a medical name, it still leaves behind a deeper question that no one seems able to answer in a complete way. It begins with a person who wakes up already tired, before the day even starts, and the pain they feel is not new or sudden, but something that has stayed with them for years and slowly shaped how they live, how they plan, and how they see themselves. Doctors have examined it carefully, tests have measured it, and the condition has been clearly identified in medical terms, with symptoms that can be tracked and treatments that can sometimes reduce the impact. But one part remains unanswered. Everything about this condition is measurable, observable, and even manageable to some degree, except one thing that matters the most: why it started at all. Every morning begins the same way, not with energy or readiness, but with a quiet awareness that the body is already behind, as if the day has started without them and they are trying to catch up before even leaving the bed. The alarm goes off, but the real struggle is not waking up. It is deciding whether the body will cooperate enough to begin moving at all. The fatigue is not the kind that comes after a long day or a poor night of sleep, because it does not go away with rest, and it does not respond to effort in the way people expect. It feels built in, constant, and difficult to explain to anyone who has not experienced it, because from the outside, nothing appears obviously wrong. At first, it was easy to dismiss. There were days when the tiredness felt stronger than usual, but it could still be explained away as stress, overwork, or lack of sleep. Life continued mostly as normal, with small adjustments that did not seem important at the time, and there was no clear moment when everything changed. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. Simple tasks began to take more effort than they should, and recovery from even minor exertion started to take longer than expected. The body no longer returned to a stable baseline, and instead seemed to hold on to the exhaustion as if it had become part of its normal state. That was when the search for answers began. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, because something that could once be ignored was now interfering with daily life in a consistent and limiting way. Appointments were scheduled, symptoms were described, and the process of trying to understand what was happening started to take shape. Tests were ordered, and each one looked at a different system, trying to find a clear signal that something was wrong in a measurable way. Blood work, imaging, and specialist consultations all aimed to narrow down the cause. But each result either came back within normal ranges or pointed to something that explained only part of the experience. Eventually, a diagnosis was given, and with it came a sense of partial relief, because having a name made the situation feel more real and easier to communicate. It meant that what was happening had been seen before, studied, and categorized in a way that others could recognize. But the diagnosis did not answer the deeper question. It described the condition, but it did not explain how it began in this specific life, at this specific time, in this specific person. It labeled the symptoms, but it did not reveal the origin. Treatments were introduced, and some of them helped to a degree, reducing certain symptoms or making daily life slightly more manageable. But none of them restored what had been lost, and none of them fully reversed the condition. The improvement was real, but limited. As time passed, the illness stopped feeling like something temporary and started to feel like something permanent. Not because it was officially defined that way, but because it continued without a clear end point. The uncertainty became part of the experience, and with it came a shift in identity that was difficult to accept at first. There was a moment, not tied to any specific event, when the thought became clear: This is no longer something I am dealing with. This is something I am living with. The difference may sound small, but it changes how a person sees themselves, how they plan their future, and how they understand their own limits. Daily decisions began to revolve around energy, pain, and unpredictability, and things that were once simple required planning, adjustment, or even avoidance. Life did not stop, but it changed shape in ways that were not chosen. What made it harder was not only the condition itself, but the lack of a clear beginning, because without a starting point, it became difficult to make sense of the experience in a complete way. There was no clear event to point to, no moment where everything shifted, no reason that could fully explain why this path had started. And over time, that absence of origin became its own kind of weight. Because living with something is one challenge, but not knowing where it came from is another. What makes this experience more difficult to understand is that it does not exist in isolation. Because when you begin to look beyond a single case, you start to see similar patterns appearing in the lives of other people who have never met, never shared the same environment, and yet describe something that feels almost identical in structure. There are individuals who live with constant fatigue that does not improve with rest, even after sleep, time off, or changes in lifestyle. And despite going through multiple evaluations, they receive descriptions of their condition without a clear explanation of why it began in the first place. Their daily life becomes a cycle of managing energy, avoiding triggers, and adjusting expectations, while still carrying the same unanswered question. There are also people dealing with autoimmune conditions, where the body begins to react against itself in ways that can be measured through markers and tests. Yet the reason why the immune system shifted in that direction at that specific time remains unclear. Treatments can reduce the intensity, and symptoms can be monitored, but the origin often stays undefined. In other cases, the pattern appears as chronic pain that moves through the body without a consistent physical cause that can fully explain its presence. And while certain areas may show tension or inflammation, they do not always match the level of discomfort the person feels. The experience becomes real and persistent, even when the source cannot be fully identified. What connects these different situations is not the type of illness, but the structure behind it. Because in each case there is something that can be observed, measured, and named, but the starting point remains uncertain. The condition exists clearly in the present, but its origin does not follow a clear line from cause to effect. People often try to trace it back to a specific moment, such as a stressful period, a physical injury, or a major life change. But in many cases, those connections do not fully explain the depth or persistence of what followed. The timeline feels incomplete, as if something is missing between the beginning and the result. This leads to a shared experience that goes beyond symptoms, because it affects how people understand their own condition and how they explain it to others. When someone asks what caused it, the answer often becomes uncertain, not because nothing has been explored, but because nothing has fully answered the question. Over time, a pattern becomes visible, not only in the physical experience, but in the structure of the explanation itself, where there is always a gap between what is known and what remains unclear. That gap is not always visible at first, but it becomes more noticeable the longer the condition continues without a clear origin. And when enough cases begin to reflect the same structure, the question starts to shift, not only for the person experiencing it, but for anyone observing it from the outside, because it is no longer just about one condition or one individual. It becomes about a repeating pattern that does not fully fit within the explanations that are currently available. And that is the point where the experience moves from being personal to something that feels more universal, because it is not defined by a single diagnosis, but by a shared absence of a clear beginning. At this point, the focus begins to shift, not because the condition changes, but because the way it is understood starts to feel incomplete, and the gap between what can be explained and what cannot becomes harder to ignore over time. The structure of the problem becomes clearer, even if the cause does not. Medicine is able to describe what is happening inside the body with a high level of detail, and it can track changes, measure responses, and identify patterns in how the condition behaves. But this level of clarity applies mostly to the present state, not to the origin. The system explains how the condition functions, but not why it began in the first place. There are models, theories, and possible contributing factors, such as genetics, stress, environmental exposure, or lifestyle, and each of these can offer part of the picture, but in many cases, none of them fully account for the timing, intensity, or persistence of the condition in a specific individual. The explanation remains partial. What makes this more noticeable is that even when two people have the same diagnosis, their paths into that condition can look completely different, and sometimes one person can trace a possible trigger, while another cannot identify anything that clearly connects to the beginning of their symptoms. The lack of consistency makes the search for a single cause more difficult. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in the type of question being asked, because early on, the focus is usually on relief and management, which leads to questions about treatment, improvement, and daily function. But as the condition continues without a clear origin, another question starts to take more space. At some point, the question stops being, "How do I treat this?" and becomes, "Why did this begin at all?" This is not a dramatic moment, but a gradual realization that builds as each attempt to trace the condition back to a clear starting point leads to uncertainty or incomplete answers. The person begins to see that the system they are relying on can describe the current state very well, but does not always provide a satisfying explanation for how that state came into existence. This does not mean the system has failed, but it does reveal a limitation, because not every condition follows a clear and traceable path from cause to effect, at least not in a way that is currently understood or easily observed. The absence of a clear beginning becomes part of the experience itself, and when that realization settles in, it changes how the condition is viewed, because it is no longer only about managing symptoms or improving function, but also about trying to understand a starting point that does not clearly appear within the timeline of this life. That is where the tension becomes difficult to ignore, because the question is no longer just medical. It becomes personal, and at the same time, unresolved. At this stage, the question has already been clearly formed, and it does not come from theory, but from lived experience, because the person is no longer only trying to manage the condition, but is also trying to understand where it began in a way that feels complete. When the usual explanations stop at description, the search often moves toward different ways of looking at the same problem. This is where the perspective associated with Edgar Cayce is sometimes introduced, not as a replacement for medical understanding, but as a different way of organizing the same experience, using a broader frame that includes continuity instead of focusing only on the present moment. The shift is not about rejecting what is known, but about asking whether the timeline being used is wide enough to explain what is being observed. In this view, the condition is not treated as something that appeared without context, but as something that may be connected to earlier patterns of strain, imbalance, or experience that did not begin in this visible part of life. The body is still central, but it is no longer seen as the starting point, only as the place where the condition is now expressed. Cayce's readings often describe situations where physical conditions were linked to prior experiences that involved repeated stress on the body, excessive use of certain systems, or actions that created imbalance over time. And these descriptions were presented in a way that suggested continuity rather than sudden appearance. The condition was not random, but part of a longer pattern. To understand how this is framed, it helps to look at a simple example that stays grounded and does not rely on dramatic or symbolic elements. Imagine a person whose current condition involves long-term fatigue and physical depletion that does not match their current level of activity, and there is no clear event in this life that explains why the body behaves this way. In a Cayce-style interpretation, this pattern might be connected to a prior period of intense physical demand, where the body was pushed beyond its limits for extended periods, not as a single event, but as a repeated condition that gradually shaped how the system responded. The idea is not that the past directly causes the present in a simple way, but that patterns can carry forward and continue to influence how the body functions. In other cases, the interpretation might involve imbalance created through actions that affected others physically, or situations where the body was placed under conditions that disrupted its normal regulation, leading to patterns that do not fully reset when the context changes. These descriptions remain simple and focused on physical experience, not symbolic meaning. What is important here is not the specific scenario, but the structure of the explanation, because it introduces the possibility that the origin of a condition may not be located within the current timeline that the person can clearly remember or identify. The condition still exists in the present, but its starting point may be part of a longer continuity. This perspective does not claim to replace medical understanding, and it does not ask the person to ignore treatment, diagnosis, or practical care, because those remain necessary and relevant. Instead, it adds another layer that attempts to address the part of the experience that remains unexplained by current models. It is also important to keep a clear distinction between interpretation and fact, because this framework does not present itself as something that must be believed, but as a way of looking at patterns that may or may not resonate depending on the individual experience. The goal is not to convince, but to explore whether this lens provides a more complete way of understanding the question. When viewed this way, the condition is no longer only a problem that appeared without cause, but part of a pattern that may extend beyond what is immediately visible. And this changes how the question is approached, because instead of asking only what is happening now, it opens the possibility of asking what may have been carried into the present. That shift does not remove uncertainty, but it does change the shape of it. Instead of a missing origin, there is a possible continuity that has not yet been fully understood. And for some people, that difference is enough to begin looking at their condition in a new way, not as something that simply appeared, but as something that may have a deeper pattern behind it, even if that pattern is not fully clear. Once this perspective is introduced, the focus begins to widen, not by changing the original case, but by placing it next to other cases that follow a similar structure. And when enough of these are viewed together, a pattern starts to become visible that is not tied to one condition, but to how different conditions appear and persist without a clear origin. In a number of Cayce readings, individuals described physical issues that had already been identified by doctors, and in many of these cases, the readings did not focus on the symptoms themselves, but on patterns that seemed to extend beyond the current timeline, suggesting that what was being experienced in the body was not isolated, but connected to earlier states of strain, imbalance, or repeated use. There are examples of people with long-term digestive problems that do not fully respond to diet changes or treatment, where the condition continues even after multiple adjustments have been made, and the explanation offered does not contradict the physical reality, but instead places it within a broader pattern of stress on the system that may not have begun recently. In other cases, individuals experience recurring joint or muscle issues that appear without a clear injury or cause that matches the level of discomfort. And while inflammation or tension can be measured, the reason why those areas are consistently affected remains unclear within the current life timeline. The condition behaves in a way that suggests continuity rather than sudden appearance. There are also situations where respiratory or circulation-related conditions develop gradually, without a clear event that marks their beginning. And although contributing factors can be identified, they do not fully explain why the condition took hold in that specific way, at that specific time. The pattern again points towards something that does not fully fit within a single lifetime explanation. When these cases are viewed together, the common element is not the type of illness, but the structure behind it, where the body reflects something that seems to have developed over time, but without a clear starting point that can be located in recent experience. The condition feels established, as if it has history, even when that history is not visible. This is where the idea of the body as a form of memory begins to take shape, not in a symbolic way, but in a functional sense, where patterns can persist and influence how systems respond, even when the original context is no longer present or cannot be clearly identified. The body does not need to consciously remember for a pattern to continue. When this idea is placed next to modern observations, there is a point of overlap that becomes easier to recognize, because current research already shows that the body can store responses to stress, trauma, and repeated conditions in ways that affect physical health over time, even when the person is not fully aware of the origin. For example, it is widely accepted that prolonged stress can alter how the nervous system functions, how the immune system responds, and how the body regulates energy. And these changes can remain in place long after the original stress has passed. The pattern continues even when the cause is no longer active. Similarly, trauma does not always remain as a clear memory that can be easily recalled, but can instead be expressed through physical responses, habits, or sensitivities that appear without a direct connection to a specific event. The body carries the effect, even when the story is incomplete. When these modern observations are placed alongside the Cayce perspective, the connection is not exact, but it is close enough to suggest that the idea of the body carrying patterns across time is not entirely unfamiliar, even if the scope of that timeline is interpreted differently. Both views recognize that not all physical conditions begin in a simple, visible way. This does not prove that all unexplained conditions have the same origin, and it does not remove the need for medical understanding, but it does show that the concept of stored patterns influencing the body is already part of how we understand health at a basic level. And when that idea is extended slightly further, it opens the possibility that some conditions may follow patterns that are longer than we usually consider, even if that possibility cannot be fully measured or confirmed. At that point, the question is no longer whether patterns exist, but how far they might extend. When this idea is brought back into a modern context, it becomes easier to approach without needing to accept anything outside of current understanding, because there are already well-established ways to explain how the body can carry patterns that are not always fully visible or consciously remembered. The language changes, but the structure of the idea remains familiar. In psychology and neuroscience, it is widely recognized that the body and mind do not operate as separate systems, and that experiences, especially those involving stress or strong emotion, can leave lasting effects that continue to influence how the body functions over time. These effects are not always stored as clear memories, but as patterns of response. For example, when a person goes through prolonged stress, the nervous system can shift into a state that remains active even after the original situation has ended, and this can affect sleep, energy levels, digestion, and immune response in ways that feel physical, even though the initial trigger may no longer be present. The body continues the pattern because it has adapted to it. In a similar way, trauma does not always remain as a story that can be clearly told or remembered in detail, but can instead show up through physical tension, sensitivity, or recurring discomfort that seems disconnected from any current event. The person may not be able to explain where it started, but the body still reflects it. There are also cases where learned responses become automatic over time, such as heightened alertness, fatigue cycles, or pain responses that are reinforced through repetition, even when the original reason for those responses is no longer active. The pattern becomes part of how the system operates. What is important here is that these processes do not require conscious awareness to continue, and they do not always follow a clear timeline that the person can trace back step by step. The effect can remain even when the origin is unclear or forgotten. This creates a situation that looks very similar to what was described earlier, where a condition exists clearly in the present, but its starting point cannot be easily identified within the person's current memory or experience. The body reflects something real, even when the story behind it is incomplete. From this perspective, it becomes possible to understand how a condition can feel established without having a clear beginning, because the system does not need a conscious narrative to maintain a pattern. It only needs repetition and reinforcement over time. When placed next to the Cayce interpretation, the difference is not in the idea that patterns exist, but in how far back those patterns are allowed to extend, because modern psychology generally stays within the boundaries of one lifetime, while the Cayce perspective suggests that the same type of continuity may go beyond that boundary. Even without accepting that extension, the overlap between the two views is enough to show that the body carrying patterns across time is not an unusual concept, but something that is already part of how we understand human behavior and health at a practical level. This does not provide a complete answer to the original question, but it does reduce the sense that the condition is completely without context, because it shows that there are mechanisms through which patterns can persist without a clear, conscious starting point. And when that becomes clear, the idea that an illness might not have started in a simple, visible way begins to feel less distant, even if it is not fully explained. When the question shifts from how to treat the condition to where it might come from, the meaning of the illness begins to change, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that affects how it is understood and how the person relates to it over time. The condition is still there, but it is no longer seen as something completely random or without context. This does not mean that the illness is suddenly explained in a complete way, and it does not remove the uncertainty that still exists, but it introduces the possibility that what feels unclear may not be without structure, and that the absence of a visible origin does not always mean there is no deeper pattern behind it. At this point, it becomes important to make a clear distinction between responsibility and guilt, because these two ideas can easily be confused, especially when the explanation involves something that extends beyond the present moment. Guilt suggests blame and wrongdoing, while responsibility focuses on awareness and response. In this context, the idea is not that the person has done something wrong and is now facing consequences, but that they are experiencing a pattern that may have developed over time, and that understanding this pattern can change how they approach their condition. The focus is not on judgment, but on clarity. This shift allows the illness to be seen not only as something to fight against, but as something to understand. And that does not reduce the need for treatment or care, but adds another layer to how healing is defined. Healing is no longer limited to reducing symptoms, but can also include recognizing patterns and responding to them in a more informed way. For some people, this may change how they relate to their own experience, because instead of feeling completely disconnected from the origin of their condition, they begin to see it as part of a larger process that they are still connected to, even if that process is not fully clear. This does not solve the condition, and it does not provide a final answer, but it changes the direction of the question, because instead of asking only how to remove the illness, It opens the possibility of asking what it represents within a broader pattern. And for many, that shift is not about certainty, but about meaning. Because even without a complete explanation, the experience no longer feels entirely without context. When all of these pieces are placed together, the situation begins to look different. Not because a final answer has been found, but because the question is no longer limited to a single moment in time. The condition is still real, and the symptoms are still present. But the idea of where it began is no longer tied to one clear event. What becomes clearer is that not every pattern in the body starts in a way that can be easily traced. And not every condition follows a simple path that moves directly from cause to effect in a visible way. Some patterns seem to appear already formed, as if they carry a structure that existed before they became noticeable. This does not mean the illness is imagined, and it does not reduce the importance of treatment, because the physical experience is still real and still needs to be managed in practical ways. The body is responding in measurable ways, and those responses still require attention and care. But it does suggest that the absence of a clear origin does not always mean there is no origin at all, because some patterns may exist outside the part of the timeline that we can easily observe or remember. The condition may still have a history, even if that history is not fully visible. And when that possibility is considered, the experience changes slightly. Because instead of something that appeared without reason, the illness becomes something that may follow a deeper pattern, even if that pattern is not fully understood yet. At this point, the question is no longer only about illness, but about how we understand the parts of our life that do not have clear beginnings, and how we respond when something real exists without a complete explanation. The condition is still there, but the way we look at it has started to shift. It becomes less about finding a single cause that can fully explain everything, and more about recognizing that not every experience fits into a clear and simple timeline that we can easily follow from start to finish. Some parts of life remain partially hidden, even when their effects are visible. If the body can carry patterns that are not fully remembered, and if some conditions do not begin in a way that can be clearly traced, then the absence of an answer may not mean the absence of meaning. It may simply mean that the full story has not been fully seen yet, and that leads to a quieter question, one that does not ask for proof, but asks for reflection. If the body remembers more than we can explain, what part of your own story might still be incomplete or not yet fully understood?